Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Balie. My name is Jante Mosselman, and I'll be moderating this evening for you. This program is partly funded by NATO, the Public Diplomacy Grant. Before I'm going to introduce the topic and our wonderful speakers of this evening, I'm briefly going to mention that there is a live stream tonight. That means that if you don't want to end up on YouTube for eternity, then it's better to be a little bit quiet and ask your questions at the bar. There is room for questions at the end of this program. Tonight we'll talk about Europe's security. Because last year, NATO allies agreed to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense. In simple terms, Europe has decided it needs to build its defense again. And that rebuilding isn't only about the war that's being fought right now in Ukraine. It's also about what comes after, whether the fighting slows, freezes, or stops, because Europe is facing because Europe is facing a security environment that has become tougher, more unpredictable, and more transactional. So the question becomes very concrete. What is Europe prepared to do in this changed world, and how do we make sure that answer is truly shared across the continent? Because there is something that we need to recognize. The threats that Europe faces are not experienced in the same way everywhere. For countries on the East, security is less of an abstract debate and more of a daily reality. And this is why it's so important to talk to each other and to bring different perspectives. So I'm very glad that our guest has come all the way from Poland to be with us tonight. She'll be joined later by Nikki Sterkenburg and Alex Krijger. I'm going to introduce you, and then you will give a a regular keynote. Justyna Gotkowska, and she's the Deputy Director of the Centre for Eastern Studies in Warsaw, one of Europe's leading strategic think tanks on security and defense, where she also has the Security and Defense Department. She specializes in NATO, EU defense policy, and military cooperation in Central, Northern, and Baltic Europe. Justyna, it's a wonderful that you're here tonight with us. It's a pleasure to have you. Very grateful that you could join us. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Shall I?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And I'll bring you a glass of water.
First of all, I would like to give my thanks to the Balie for the invitation, for the organization of this event, and for letting me share my Polish perspective on where we are with the European security. And I'm looking forward to a great discussion afterwards, since I'm aware that my perspective might be a bit different than yours. And I'm looking forward to see your reactions and to listen to your questions. First, I would like to give you my broader perspective on the current developments in the international relations. Second, I will focus on the European theater, Russia, and the war in Ukraine. And third, I will give you my thoughts on the future of European defense. Starting with the global level. We are confronted with a fundamental change in international relations that has already had huge impact on Europe in general, on Ukraine in particular, and more is to come. This change has been fueled by growing imbalances, multiple crises within the liberal international order that was built after the Second World War, with some changes after the end of the Cold War. This order was built primarily by the US, with the West at its center. This order was, at least in the last 3 decades, based more or less upon liberal values and principles, shaping Western policies, claiming to be universal, international law and international organizations with preference for multilateralism, free trade and globalization that also the Netherlands profited so much from. And it was all underpinned by the US military power within regional security arrangements in Europe and Asia, and also partly in the Middle East. And for more than a decade now, this order has been slowly contested with an acceleration in the last year. It has been contested by the challengers, and now it's being contested by the hegemon in this order, meaning the US. Where this contestation came from, first, it was due to the political, economic, and military rise of China. China claims to challenge the US global dominance in foreign security and economic policies. China wishes to create a Sino-centric world. It wants to push the US out of the Indo-Pacific. It wants to have its own sphere of influence. It wants to have a global domination in economy, technology, and regional insecurity. China has in recent years undermined this international liberal order, especially with regard to free trade, globalization, but also increasingly insecurity by its build-up in Asia. Second, this order has been contested by Russia in Europe. Russia is strategically aligned with China in its wish to undermine the US Western-centric international order, although there is a different background for that. Russia is a politically and economically declining power, different than China, but with an outsized military, and it sees the opportunity to get its own sphere of influence in the changing global landscape. Russia has anticipated that the US is gradually becoming overstretched. It's preoccupied with China. It sees Europe as too weak to act on its own. And this perception has emboldened Russia to go after its goals by starting an invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014, together with annexation of Crimea, and to go for a full-scale war in 2022, and also by deploying so-called hybrid measures against Europe. And third, this contestation of the international liberal order comes also from the West that has been undergoing internal changes. Europe has greatly benefited from this order as small and medium-sized countries which were strong diplomatically and economically but weak militarily. They were able to thrive in the world of norms and rules that limited the actions of the hegemon, the US, and the aspiring regional challengers by pushing the costs also of security guarantees to the US. And in spite of multiple warnings in the recent years, Europe has been widely unable to reform, especially in security and defense area. It was unable to take over more of the economic and military costs of upholding the international order along the US. But also the US did nothing to curb the hyper-globalization and moving abroad production capacities from the US that benefited the biggest US companies and that resulted in disindustrialization, impoverishment of the US working and middle class. And in consequence of all these processes, it brought right-wing forces were brought to power that contested the liberal international order by perceiving it as disadvantageous to the US due to its misuse by its competitors as well as partners and allies. And the US, as we all have read in the National Security Strategy that was published in December last year, is not willing anymore to maintain this liberal international order in terms of values, international institutions, free trade, and globalization. And the US, Washington, wants also to renegotiate security arrangements in relevant regions, among them in Europe. Washington wants to change the paradigm in international relations, moving to the spheres of influence concept, perceiving Latin America as the US one. It wants to focus on containing China in the Pacific, and it wants the allies and partners in Europe, Asia, and in the Middle East to primarily ensure own security. And for Europe, it's a huge challenge due to the ongoing war in Ukraine and due to the imminent threat coming from Russia that I will talk in a minute. So where are we in this broader picture in Europe? As I said, Russia wants to challenge the European security order, guaranteed so far by the US. Russian goals with regard to European security have been best described in the two draft treaties that Russia presented to the US and to NATO in December 2021, just before the war, the invasion of Ukraine. And there are 3 points that Russia made. First, Russia wants to restore control over the post-Soviet space with the priority of subordinating Ukraine. Second, Russia wants to create a buffer zone in Northern and Central Europe with limiting sovereignty of the countries in question. It wants to remove NATO and US presence from the region, make the region defenseless, prone to Russian political, economic, and military coercion. And third, Russia wants to push the US out of Europe, which would bring a shift to a great power concert on the continent. It would give Russia a preferential position with regard to its economic interests, political interests, a veto power in European foreign and security policy by the use of military coercion. These are, of course, the Russian dreams, Russian ambition, Russian goals. And so far, Russia has not been able to achieve them. We are in the 6th year of war in Ukraine, but we need to have in mind that this is the Russian thinking. This Russian thinking has not changed, and they are still pursuing these goals. So Russia decided to start a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 because it felt it is time for an abrupt change in European security order. But Putin took this decision out of misperceptions about the Russian military strength, about Ukraine's political, military, and societal weakness, Western weakness and unwillingness to act, and presumption that Russia will achieve its goals with regard to Ukraine by force. And where are we now? We are in the nearly sixth year of war of attrition, with Russia not fulfilling its goals. But at the same time, with Russia not changing its goals and not changing the opinion that in the end it will win. The situation that the front line is more or less stable. Even if Russia has gained some ground in recent months. Russia controls between 17% to 20% of Ukraine's territories, including Crimea and parts of 4 Ukrainian regions. After 6 years, it has not been able to take control over the Donbas region, where it is fighting since 2014. And in the minds of the Russian, it meant to be a 3-day war. So from this perspective, Russia is not winning. But as I said, from the Russian perspective, the time has come or is coming to fulfill and to reach its goals. 2025, 2026, Russia has intensified attacks on the Ukrainian critical infrastructure, especially energy system, in order to break the Ukrainian resilience and will to fight. But Ukrainian military, with all its problems, especially on the front line, is withstanding military pressure coming from Russia. But Russia assumes that the war fatigue in the West is growing and the support for Ukraine will be decreasing in the end. Putin hoped that, and maybe still hopes, that the Trump administration will press Ukraine to accept a bad deal that would eventually lead to Russia taking full control of Ukraine with time. If that is not possible, Russia thinks that the war of attrition will eventually lead to Ukraine's defeat and Russia dictated conditions for a de facto Ukraine surrender. But at the same time, Russia has increasing problems with economy, also in terms of mobilization of soldiers to the front. So the picture does not seem rosy with regard to Russian ability to wage war in the coming years. How does Ukraine looks like in this picture? Ukraine, both the government and the society know what is at stake. And the war is not about territories. It's about the survival of Ukraine as a state and survival of Ukrainians as an independent nations. And as Russia does not want to perceive them as a separate entity. And according to the polls, and I think this is worth underlining, 65% of Ukrainians are prepared to endure harsh living conditions as long as necessary. And we all are witnessing through different channels the attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and believe me, we had over the past months down to minus 20 degrees in Warsaw, and the same temperatures are right now in Kiev. But 70% of Ukrainians think that Ukraine can defend itself successfully. Only 12% think that surrender is an option. And 69% don't believe in peace negotiations or that the peace negotiation can bring an actual peace. or just peace for Ukraine. The West, Europe has begun to understand far-reaching Russian goals towards European security order. It's not only about Ukraine. If Russia wins, it will go farther to achieve its second and third goal I mentioned earlier. And we cannot exclude Russian military operation against NATO if Russia wins in Ukraine. Russia has started or the West has started to mobilize resources with regard to supporting Ukraine, and the West has been increasing defense spending, West meaning Europe, albeit too slowly and not high enough. If we last year you hosted the NATO summit in The Hague, 5th year of war, in which only then NATO countries have jointly decided to spend 3.5% for defense expenditure and 1.5% of GDP for defense-related investments. 5th year of war, and Europe is not able to produce enough ammunition to fill in the gaps the US have left, and we are dependent heavily on US deliveries in certain segments of ammunition, military equipment. The US, under Trump administration, has shifted the burden of financial and military support to Ukraine to Europe, and would like to end the war for many reasons. Nobel Peace Prize for President Trump, focus on China, mirages of economic deals with Russia, and it wants to do so by pressing concessions primarily out of Kiev and possibly, and we'll see, the negotiations are ongoing, out of Moscow. In the ongoing peace negotiations, we have now a US-Ukraine and partly European negotiated framework, 20 points plan, security guarantees with a European-led stabilization mission, agreement on Ukraine reconstruction, or US-Ukrainian agreement on Ukraine's reconstruction, with some issues still unresolved. Control over the Ukrainian-held part of Donbas region, strategically or militarily important for Ukraine, and unresolved issue about parliamentary and presidential elections in Ukraine to be held still under the martial law, which is questionable or controversial in Ukraine. In January last year, I published an article on how to approach Trump administration with regard to ending the war in Ukraine. I put there 4 points. First, no preconditions to freezing the front line. Second, more European military support to Ukraine. Third, European boots on the ground in Ukraine, embedded in a wider framework of security guarantees. Fourth, adjusting US presence in Europe, allowing the Europeans to support Ukraine military. And parts of this plan materialized, even if back then they were rejected. Even a year ago, the idea of Europeans planning for a military operations in Ukraine, that was a highly controversial issue, and I think I was one of very few voices in Poland claiming for that. How that different points, how they relate to the agreed framework, we can discuss that later on in the discussion. I think the question which we have is just peace in Ukraine possible? And my answer is no for the short term. If there is no increased economic pressure on Russia, Putin has no incentive whatsoever to go for real peace negotiations, as he thinks he still might win this war militarily. And hence, if such a pressure will not come, this war will be ongoing. But also Russia has its weaknesses. Much will depend on how the US approaches Moscow, whether it decides to apply more pressure, at least gradually. And with more economic and military difficulties, Russia may decide for a pause in mid to long term. But for now, I think the consensus in Poland is that, and in Ukraine, that we need to be prepared for a longer war. And what does that mean for Europe? Further financial and military support to Ukraine and quick investments in own security and defense. If Russia is stopped in Ukraine, Russia will have limited capacity to go against NATO and hence build-up of military strength in Ukraine is in our own interest. If Ukraine loses the war, Europe is next goal for the Russian war machine. And if there is a ceasefire, or a just peace, it will still mean European financial military support to Kiev and the materialization of the plans of the coalition of the willing and a European stabilization mission. Regardless of the outcome of the war, we need to keep our defense, deterrence and resilience high. Russia will remain an aggressive power on the continent, looking for opportunities to weaken us. This is not only the ruling elites, it's not only Putin that has this thinking I described, it is widely across the Russian establishment, and is also being anchored by heavy propaganda during the last decade in the Russian population. Third and last point, European defense. I think that Europe last and early this year has become brutally confronted with harsh geopolitical realities. That first, Russia is a military threat to Europe, and the materialization of this threat largely depends on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And second, and I think most important and relevant this year, the US changed posture, aggressiveness in pursuing own political, economic and military interests, shifting attention and resources to the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific, telling Europe that it needs to take responsibility for own conventional defense with a more limited US contribution. That is something that is new, although not entirely new, because we have heard this message coming from Washington for the past decade, but it was too soft, and we had to be confronted with the brutal power of this administration to realize this, as we are doing that now. How shall Europe shape its own security in such an environment? After years of not investing in own defense, as they should have, European allies are in general dependent on the US in many areas with regard to conducting defense operations. And the main conventional military gaps are command and control of large-scale defense operations, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, strategic lift, both air and sea transport, logistics and production capacity of certain types of ammunition and equipment. And European armed forces face structural challenges, insufficient reserves in personnel, in material, equipment and ammunition. And hence, the best and preferred outcome for European defense is to reshape NATO as a much more European alliance in cooperation with the US, even if we have to deal currently with a very difficult partner, with maintaining a limited US footprint in conventional area and with US extended nuclear deterrence in place. And the goal is to shape this process of diminishing US military engagement in Europe in a coordinated and structured manner so that it doesn't leave gaps in military capacities that Russia would like to challenge. The EU, from my perspective, should play a supportive role in generating military capabilities, developing arms industry in Europe. I think it's unuseful to go into discussions about European Defence Union, European Army and so on. If we are militarily tested, that will be the next decade. And it's illusionary to think that that Europe, if there would be a willingness, would be able to build an alternative to NATO structures and processes. And last point, we need to shape not only militarily but also politically the rearmament of Europe. Less of the US political and military clout will mean a change in the balance of power between the major European allies. With stronger Germany, ambitious France, the UK outside of the EU, rearmed Poland as the biggest front country, integrated Nordic Baltic region, Turkey as a powerful and important outsider. We need to think and how to shape this political dimension carefully, because it can bring a lot of tensions. And summing up, I have an impression that major Western European countries, on the level of their current governments, understand where the challenges are both regard to Russia and the US. But the current official perceptions are not always shared across Western European societies and entire political elites. And hence, such an events like this one, from my perspective, are super and very important. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Justyna Gotkowska. Maybe a few questions, and maybe to start, because I read the article you wrote almost a year ago, and you named it very eloquently "At the Table" or "On the Menu." About a year ago, a ceasefire felt quite close, or closer than now. What was the biggest sort of surprise for you in the past year, looking at where we were then and where we are now?
I think that was the unpredictability of the Trump administration that has confronted us with repeating cycles of attempts to come back to peace negotiations that Russia skillfully used, and then where Ukrainian with European help had to manage the process. And we are right now in another phase of such a process. I mentioned this 20-point plans, security guarantees, reconstruction agreements. Europe, together with Ukraine, have successfully managed to rewrite the original US proposals that were elaborated together with some Russian input. And we are not in a bad place. But what will come is pretty much unpredictable, because President Trump has its own ideas, has its own drive for ending another war, which is making us, which confronts us with this unknown, what turn of the events will take. So this unpredictability has been to that level, I think, has been surprising. But surprising is also that we are we are in the second year of this administration, and I think the most skeptical voices, pessimistic voices, have predicted that this administration and President Trump will strike a deal with Russia, a quick deal with Russia, because this is what he wants, and this has not happened.
And
this is another surprise.
And what does that say, that it hasn't happened? What does that mean?
I think that they have misjudged the Russians. They thought that I think the president himself especially thinks in business-like terms, that you can always have a deal that is beneficial to both parts. And the Russians think differently. They think in zero-sum game. So they are not willing to strike a deal that is somehow guaranteeing a peace that would be beneficial to the Ukrainians and to the Russians. It is not their goal. And I think this is something that was difficult to understand by people like Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff, for example, with this business background, where you can always make a deal.
Russia's not about capitalistic deals, maybe.
It's not about. It's about whole Ukraine for Russia. The game is about whole Ukraine. It's not about territories. It's not about resources. It's about control, political, military, economic, of whole Ukraine. And Russia is not willing to share this piece of land, or that it perceives as theirs.
You mentioned in your lecture that one of the things that was very controversial, and you were one of the only people saying that in Poland, is the Western boots on the ground. Why is that so controversial in Europe?
I think there are few countries that have enough military capabilities to be engaged both in Ukraine and to uphold its commitments within NATO. there are limits for European engagement in Ukraine without US support and these key critical capabilities that I mentioned. ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control of bigger, larger operations, logistics, and a few others. And without the cooperation with the US, without this US backup of such an operation, I think hardly a European coalition of the willing is not willing to go into Ukraine. And therefore it was so key for the Europeans, for President Macron, to bind the US into this framework. For me, it is still a virtual discussion at this point of time because it will not materialize. As I was speaking, Russia will not agree to this framework, but maybe in some time, a year, 2 years, there will be conditions where such a European military support mission would be possible in Ukraine to support the ceasefire together with the US. Let's hope for that. That would mean that Russia would understand that it will not win militarily, it will not win through other means, and that it is prepared to end this war at the front line, and the West, Europe, together with the US, can provide some guarantees for Ukraine, together with maintaining Ukraine's strong military.
Now, I don't want to be super pessimistic, but taking into account the unpredictability of Donald Trump, and then trying to have a US backup that would be in word and maybe not in kind. What would that US backed mean if it's so unpredictable? You cannot count on that, or can you, do you think? How would it take shape?
Well, that would mean involvement of the US in this coalition of the willing that is led primarily by France and the UK. That would mean availability of US resources, ISR, for this coalition. That would mean enhanced presence of the US certain capabilities, for example, in Poland and Romania, countries that are neighboring Ukraine, so that if Russia breaks the ceasefire, Europeans would react and US would support that. And that would mean, and I think there is already an agreement on that, that the US is in charge of monitoring the ceasefire with some, not boots on the ground, but with some assets, ISR, like that would not be placed in huge quantities on the ground in Ukraine. I think this is still whole speculations. I don't know how the war in Ukraine will end. I don't know. No. And I think no one knows.
No one knows, no.
But I think that we should not overestimate Russia, and we should not underestimate Ukrainians. 6 years of such a full-scale invasion, war of attrition, and they are still holding the line. The society is still willing to fight against the Russians. The Russians, of course, have much more of resources to wage this war, but we also need to remind ourselves that it was the Trump administration that in autumn last year imposed additional sanctions onto Russian oil companies. And that has a huge impact on the Russian economy and is still having. There is a lot of inconsistency in this administration. I perceive it skeptically, critically, but I still try to see the positive areas where there has been positive decisions. And as I told you before, we are after first year of this administration and still no bad peace deal in sight, with a reasonable framework of being discussed right now. And let's hope that after the Russian refusal of this framework, more pressure on Russia will come. Will there? That's a huge question mark. We'll see.
We'll see. Maybe one last question before I ask the other speakers to join us, because it has been incredible. I agree with you, the Ukrainian resilience. Poland also really has stepped up over the last years and has shown huge support for Ukraine by taking in many, many refugees as well. The relationship, and because I want to mention this because I think we can, as Europe, learn from overcoming our histories, because Poland and Ukraine, they have quite a difficult history. So can you tell me what has happened, what has shifted in the general attitude towards each other?
Poland has been, in the first 2-3 years of war, I think that the first country to support Ukraine financially, humanitarily, militarily. We have sent a lot of military equipment from the operational units to Ukraine. And the acceptance from the Polish society towards Ukrainians coming to Poland was huge. What the Polish government have done for the Ukrainians, meaning equaling them in status to Polish citizens with all the social benefits and the ability to work in Poland, that has been unprecedented. But then problems and challenges came with Ukrainians using the Polish healthcare system, social system, and so on. And I think some resentments came with that. We have had difficult historical issues unresolved, with Ukrainians being reluctant to be open for Polish requests with regard to the so-called the Volhynian massacre in 1943. That has been a controversial issue in the Polish-Ukrainian relations, and that has not, this Ukrainian stance has not changed, and that has generated additional resentments on the Polish side. And then you had the economic level, where the European Union opened the common market for Ukrainian goods. And since Poland has been the main neighbor of Ukraine, the Ukrainian products flooded the Polish market, and these were agricultural products, so also a controversial issue for many Polish producers. I think the mood has slightly changed. And additionally, I think Russia realized that it needs to target Poland, the main active country, active supporter of Ukraine. And we thought we were immune to such Russian disinformation measures, operations against us, but we weren't. And Russia did not use pro-Russian messages, but it used anti-Ukrainian messages. And that has additionally influenced the Polish public opinion. So the Poles right now are more skeptical towards military support to Ukraine, but that also is linked to the perception that Russia wages a huge hybrid campaign against us, also with military means, drones and Polish airspace, and that we need to concentrate on building up Polish armed forces, and hence the amount of military equipment, military support for Ukraine needs to be limited. And Poles have been very wary to station Polish soldiers in Ukraine.
Yes.
And I think...
And why? Because they think they need them for their own country.
I think this is one of the reasons. Second, I think it's also a bit of a distrust towards European partners and towards how shall we react if Polish troops, or how Europe would react if Polish ground troops would be attacked in Ukraine. What would that mean for us, for Article 5? Would that enhance our security, or would that be beneficial also for Ukraine, or would that show that these are the security guarantees for Ukraine provided by Europeans are simply nothing? And I think this credibility question is high on the agenda and discussions in Poland.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question to also lay on the table here. I'm going to ask Nikki Sterkenburg and Alex Krijger to join us, and I'm briefly going to introduce them to you. Please have a seat already. Nikki Sterkenburg is Professor of Investigative Journalism at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and alongside her academic work, she is a National Security Advisor at Berenschot. Her research and professional work focus on the intersection of security and society, including polarization, extremism, disinformation and their impact on democratic institutions and public debate. Also here's Alex Krijger. He is an historian and geopolitical analyst who focuses on international relations and the changing world order. Recently, he has argued that Europe needs to become less dependent on the United States and that this shift can also create opportunities for Europe. He's the founder and managing partner of Krijger & Partners, advising companies on geopolitical risks and government relations, and he also teaches geoeconomics at Leiden University. Very warm welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us. Maybe to start where we just finished, with the distrust between nations and the believing each other's credibility. Alex, would you like to elaborate on that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, so thanks for the introduction and presentations. I think when it comes to where we are at the moment, so yeah, it's almost 4 years now, right? February 22nd. And so what I see in Europe at the moment, there are a lot of intentions, big words. Macron particularly is very good in those things. But I like to focus on the facts. And when it comes to the real support as Europeans for Ukraine, now the gap that the Americans have left, we have to be honest, we're not really doing what we could do. So there's an issue. And so what I see, there's almost a situation with multiple realities. And also when it comes to the Russian threat, yeah, I think it's being perceived differently in Poland and the Baltic republics than, for instance, in Spain or some other countries more far away. So there are a lot of things going on at the moment, at the same time, and that's got to do with the shifting world order you talked about, which I think some people always try to say that it's because of Trump, the world order shifting. I think that's not true. The reason is, I think that we didn't understand as West, as Europe and North America, that the world is significantly changing. Think about demographics, for instance. I always give this example that we are with 8 billion people around the world, and 6.5 billion are living in the global south and just 1.5 in the west. And if you take all the people of the European Union together, it's just 5.5% of all population. So 95% of the people in the world are not living in the European Union. And we still look at the world through a European lens. So a lot of things are changing at the same time. We're some kind of interim transition period between the old world order and the new, probably more multipolar world order. And Europe has to find its way there. And then at the same time, we've got this biggest war since the end of World War II. So, and Europe is struggling with that. So what I still see is European leaders, big words, and of course also the new government, a lot of intentions, also a new coalition agreement. But the question is, what will really happen? Mm-hmm. So we have to be honest in terms of that there are multiple realities. And I think we really have to think in terms of strategies. And reality is still that a couple of years we're already in this terrible war, and think about all those people who lost their lives, etc. But there's still no clear European strategy. We're still waiting. Every time Trump is doing something, and then we react. So what's our story? What's our narrative? What's our strategy regarding Ukraine? For me, it's not clear.
Mm-hmm. Nikki, would you agree on that?
A little bit. Well, Europe was founded as a peace project originally, and the entire architecture of the European Union is developed to make war between member states impossible by, well, political solutions, interdependence, economic interdependence, so that it would be unthinkable. So Europe, it has the DNA of consensus building, listening to everyone, making sure everyone feels heard, and that can make Europe very slow every now and then. On the other hand, what we do see whenever there's a crisis, whether it's a banking crisis, pandemic, terrorist attacks, then suddenly Europe can be very quick. If you look at the COVID recovery fund, for example, we can arrange things within days. The only problem is with Europe is that it's always very reactive and not so much proactive or preparing. It's we look at what's coming towards us and then we start acting on it. And we could go very quick, but I do agree with Alex that when it comes to Ukraine, there's still a lot of debate going on. Are we doing enough? Should we do more? How should we regard it? On the other hand, I'm also very positive because I do believe strongly with Europe that when it's necessary, they will act very quickly.
And do you have examples of where we did? Well, you say the COVID, but do you have maybe, to go into depth, what are we missing? What are we not doing quickly enough now that we should be doing faster?
Well, I think now if we look at the war in Ukraine, it's very often now in terms of military support, military supplies, while we could also have support in very different other ways. And that's something we're not doing now. And also something we're not doing is also discussing this with European citizens, what needs to be done, why we're doing it, why we're spending so much money, as well on the NATO spending targets, for example. And I think we should have that debate much more, and also just to become more resilient when we need to.
Is the NATO spending budget a discussion in Poland at all, or does everybody more or less agree with that it's necessary?
Well, Poland will spend this year, I think, nearly 5% of GDP for defense. So as the majority of the northeastern flank countries. So the threat perception is, I think, different, is guiding the actions of the governments and is shaping the acceptance of the societies towards such big investments in defense. And we are preparing for worst case scenarios. We don't know how the war in Ukraine will end. If it ends badly, as I said, we are preparing that Russia may use opportunities, windows that it sees of political military weakness on part of Europe, on part of the West, on part of NATO, to attack us militarily. And that will be Baltic states, Poland, Sweden, Finland might be the goals and will be the first responders. And we need to be prepared, and there is a clear understanding of that. We are seeing that Western Europe is lagging behind, and when for us, Russia has been the factor to change our thinking and to accelerate rearmament, for Western Europe, paradoxically, it's the US. It is because of the US you are starting to spend more than 2% of GDP, not because of Russia. And this is something that creates a bit of frustration in Poland across the northeastern flank. And for this reason, I think, at least for this reason, the Trump administration is perceived as the one that has finally, with brutality, made the Western Europeans to see the world as it is, and to spend more.
And then maybe from the Dutch side of things, why were we not able to, see it from the Polish perspective?
Regarding what? The Russian threat?
Yes.
I think it's different. If you would all after the end of this evening walk here outside the building and ask people here in Leidseplein, what do you see as main threats? If you talk with young people, also if you look at recent research, people might say climate change, for instance, or disinformation, or terrorism. And I don't think if you would ask 10 people that all 10 will say the Russians are coming. No, they will not come to Amsterdam.
No.
So, but there is the hybrid dimension. People are not crazy and they know about the 72 hours. And everyone has been informed of that. But there is something also in terms of different perceptions. And I think where we can find each other in Europe when it comes to spending more time and more attention and more money on defense is that we all have to agree that the world order is changing and that Americans don't see Europe as the center of the universe anymore. For them, it's homeland US, it's the Western Hemisphere, that's why it's Panama, Venezuela, Cuba, Canada, Greenland. It's almost like the game I played in my student house, Risk. It's terrible, but it's the reality. And that's the way he thinks. And then it's Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned in your presentation. So it's very simple. We have to stand on our own feet as Europeans. And I think it's time, 81 years after the end of the Second World War, it's time for it. So I compare it a lot with, let's say, you're still in your 30s and living at home and you're feeling very comfortable that your mother is doing everything. And now you're being kicked out of the house and it's time to stand on your own feet. But the problem is we have to do it all at the same time.
Yes.
Become more strategic autonomous when it comes to energy, industry, digitalization, defense security. And that costs money. And that's a lot of priorities at the same time. And then, let's be honest, we don't feel the threat from the Russians as the people in the Baltics, Poland, but also in Scandinavia. And then there is an issue, what Nikki said. There is something about communication. I mentioned it very often to politicians. For me, it's still very strange that with the biggest pandemic in 100 years, we did see Hugo de Jonge every Tuesday evening, right? And so the Minister of Health with the Prime Minister almost every week with updates. I've never seen an extra press conference on the biggest war in Europe since World War II. Never. And we all have to prepare. We have to prepare for what? 72 hours. Okay. But why? What's the perspective? What's the entire story? What's the real Russian threat? When I talk with generals or politicians, tell me, what's the real threat for us?
What did they say?
Then they mentioned a couple of things and also a couple of very unpleasant things which could happen. But then, we cannot really talk about that too much because that can scare people out. And then I think, but what about the Scandinavians? They talk with people. Last week there was a presentation, another update by a couple of ministers in Sweden, press conference, extra press conference. Ambassador of Ukraine was there to talk about new support packages from Scandinavian countries, in this case Sweden, to Ukraine. And there is a reluctancy because we don't want to scare the Dutch people. On the other hand, we ask them to do a lot of things with the 72 hours.
Yes.
And I think, take your people serious. We're not stupid. We're not children.
No, but we do always think things won't happen to us. We always thought, okay, we're just going to stay neutral and then Germany is not going to invade the pandemic. It's not going to happen with us. And I think part of the answer of communication, I think part of it, or what might offer opportunities, is the 5% NATO commitment, because it's 3.5% for core defense and 1.5% for security-related spending. And that opens important possibilities: critical infrastructure, civil preparedness, digital resilience, strengthening the industrial base for the defense. And this is where citizens can benefit. When we have stronger bridges, more robust energy grids, for example, better protected digital systems, just to mention something. And I do agree that we should get much more updates on this part, maybe technical briefings in Parliament, for example, or a press conference, just to become very much aware. And we also need a change in paradigm, because, as the Dutch, we always think, we're not important, this is not happening.
This is not our
us.
thing. Yes, Justyna, please. Yes, please.
Because I might surprise you, because I don't think that, or at least some people in Poland think that the Russians might come to Warsaw physically, as they are invading Ukraine, eastern Ukraine at least. But I don't think that will be the scenario. The scenario will not be a war of the kind in Ukraine. The scenario will be to neutralize critical infrastructure, military infrastructure in Poland, to coerce, to create a different field for negotiations. They might attempt to have some limited, military invasion, for example, in the Baltic states, but the rest of us will be targeted differently. That will be subversive operations of people who have been placed in Poland, in the Baltic, in Scandinavia, in Germany, also in the Netherlands, because you are might be an important hub for military deliveries and military reinforcements from the US, from the UK, and you will be faced with strikes targeting critical infrastructure. And the same will be for Poland, with more intensity, because Poland is more important geographically, frontline state, strong military, willing to be engaged. And the game will be not to become invaded, but the game will be to create a different world for Europe, where will be put or made to discuss with the Russians security and defense, foreign policy, economic relations in a very different manner. And I think this is the perspective that should be linked to what you were talking about, so this changing world order, and what would be the effects for the normal Dutch that are not thinking in these terms.
But the point is that I also did share, let's say, an update on all the hybrid, unconventional activities that are already going on from Russia towards different European countries, including the Netherlands. But we never talk about it as a whole perspective, because there is an unconventional war already going on. But if we don't say that, and if we keep it focused on, let's say, only Ukraine with the terrible war that's going on, and with only the threat for, let's say, the Baltics and Poland, then we're not honest, I think, with our own population. So I see a miscommunication there, and that doesn't help. That would be really important, I think, that we're much more open. There's a role for NATO. Secretary General Rutte is doing it quite often in presentations. But I think we can do more, and also in a few weeks from now, or not weeks from now, but let's say the February 22nd, which is coming. That's a good moment, I think, to give a good update to the citizens in Europe, by every government, on where are we, why are we supporting Ukraine, what does it cost us, why are we doing it, what's the threat, and that's a dimension I'm still missing. Yeah.
That's speaking about the public, but Nikki, I think in one of our conversations leading up to this event, you also said that at least, the Dutch government, Dutch institutions, they have been catching up quite rapidly with this changing world. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you just look at the reports also from the General Intelligence Service or from the Dutch National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism, like the state threat assessment, you do see there's a lot of it in there. However, it's not like there's a broad number of people reading it, but they are getting prepared, and they do have a lot of crisis response measurement talks and how they should do it. For example, we might become, as the Netherlands, an important hub for military supplies. But for example, if that's the case, if we're going into Article 5, we might lose the roads.
Maybe if not everybody knows what is Article 5, you mentioned it as well.
Whenever there's a military conflict, and as the Netherlands, as a NATO member state, we are involved in it as well. There are old crisis response measurements stemming from the 50s, basically where we agreed that we would become an important hub for military goods, but that would mean losing the roads for some time. It would mean losing the port of Rotterdam or a part of it for some time, or the airport for some time, also the train tracks, maybe.
The interesting thing is, sorry to interrupt, that is already going on.
Yeah.
So
not as full military conflict.
Ports are working on this in the Netherlands. Hospitals are working on this. I do a lot of presentations, and I'm surprised to see that a lot of cities already working on this. Everybody's working on it. Everybody's working on preparations. And then I think, okay, but who's having the oversight? Who is in control? Who's informing us as entire population what's going on? And so that's fascinating to see that so many organizations, companies and others are preparing. The entire health sector in the Netherlands is preparing in hospitals. And but for what and why? And if we're not being informed, then we don't also see the bigger picture, and also regarding Ukraine. It would help, I think, for the public political support.
Yeah, but I do think they know the for what and the why, just not the how. So there are reports on it. People are practicing it. People are doing all sorts of crisis situation training and everything going on. They do. The thing is, most of it is aimed as just a short crisis. And if you look into the crisis literature, crisis literature, a normal crisis is basically 2 weeks, most of it. Well, you see now with the war in Ukraine, it's already lasting 6 years. So that's something we really need to turn around. That the crisis of the future, it's not going to be 2 weeks. It's going to last years.
You had, but maybe I want to go a bit more on a bit away from the preparations that are happening, and to what are the scenarios for Ukraine, and what are they? So, in case of a ceasefire, well, then we can all sort of.
Yeah, what could happen?
What could happen?
Yeah.
What happened?
No, I think the risk is, and it will be interesting to hear what you are saying, Justyna. But there is a possibility that, let's say, the current U.S. administration is very focused on the midterms, which is in November, just a few months from now. And I think it's for Trump very important, also in order to win those elections, because if he doesn't win, he will be a lame duck president. So we have to think the unthinkable in terms of the midterms. Everything is possible. It's still possible that they will not go through. It's still possible that they will take out a couple of states. Everything is possible. So I think the pressure, one of the scenarios could be, I think it's very likely scenarios, that the pressure from the US government, and we have to see what they say in Munich in the coming days, the pressure on Europe, and particularly on Zelensky, to make a deal in the coming months. So around June, I think that will go up enormously. And then there will be some kind of ceasefire, and then Putin has to think, what will help me regarding the midterms? Maybe it's better if Trump keeps the entire Congress. So I will make some kind of deal. And then the nasty part begins, because then there's a very bad deal with no clear security agreements, and then the Europeans have to take over, because one thing is crystal clear, it's our problem. The Europeans have to take over Ukraine in terms of the end of the war and what will happen next. So in terms of the troops and whatever. And that's, I think, very risky. And what I'm missing at the moment still, despite all the great work by the Coalition of the Willing, because they're really doing a great job, how can you keep the initiative and to avoid that it's every time the Americans who take the lead? Because still a lot of things could happen in the coming months because of those midterms, I think.
True. We are seeing more pressure on Ukraine with regard to the two unresolved issues, parliamentary presidential elections, that this administration would like Ukraine to be held in May, possibly, so spring, late spring, early summer. And the Donbas, so the territory. So to give up the rest of Donbas, they are keeping, which is heavily fortified, which would mean, if given to Russia, would mean defenseless Ukraine in the need of building up lines of defense beyond Donbas. And that would be difficult. But the question is about Russia. Would the Russians accept such a deal without any other compromises on part of Ukraine? Would Ukraine agree? I think Ukraine has agency. And then this European part. Shall we accept such a deal? Or shall we stand up, as we did in Greenland case, and openly say that we'll not accept it, we'll try to support Ukraine as we can. It will be difficult. Ukraine relies on US intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, targeting especially. This is key to them maintaining the operations and defense along the front line, targeting the infrastructure in Russia with the drones that they have been doing so far. But I do believe there is scope for European initiative, and we can. And I think we cannot swallow what the US will prescribe here. And I do agree, we need to find it to be more active and not only nodding if there will be pressure for a bad deal.
Yeah, and also in terms of what happens after the ceasefire, right? Then who's taking the initiative, who's willing to make sure that the new line, whatever it may be, which is from here to Milan, if I am not mistaken, so enormous. Someone has to protect it, right? Yeah, and then the French and UK have to take the lead, but then also Dutch will be involved. That is still not clear, I think.
Yeah, but I still do not envisage a deal and a ceasefire. I don't think the Russians are prepared to do so. I think they are still in a winning mode, and unless the US will deliver them all of Ukraine on a plate, they will not go for it.
Yeah, on the other hand, if they're not willing to move, then I would not be surprised that, again, Trump needs the deal before the midterms, that he will blame Zelensky and the Ukrainian government for not making a deal. I would not be surprised if that's going to be one of the scenarios, and then Europe has to respond again. So it's one of the unfortunate, but that's, I think, one of the scenarios that we really could involve in the coming months.
I think we need to be vigilant, and so far we have been turning the ideas that come from the Trump administration, president himself, and partly from the Russians, and then doing a cautious crisis management. We have been successful so far. I hope and I do believe that we understand the gravity of the situation, and both the Ukraine and Europe will cooperate here. I'm worried. This administration, the president is unpredictable, but look at the Greenland example. That has been evolving quite disastrously, actually. And we managed, by being more active, more proactive, more standing up to this administration, to show to Trump that the costs are too high. And the question is what will be the situation also within the Republican Party in the US. There are different issues that they are preoccupied right now with, this deportation issue, migration, opposition, right? Epstein issue, Venezuela, Latin America. So there is a lot on the plate. And I'm not sure that Ukraine, of course, it's important, ending the end of another war for Trump for the midterms, but it's not key. As key for the American public. Economy is key for the American public, and hence this administration is looking very closely to that. So we are on a very in very shaky waters, shaky grounds, and it's really difficult to predict which way all that will go. We will need to stay vigilant, focused, and if needed, we need to stand up.
Maybe going a bit towards, because we're not talking about the UK, France, the Netherlands. There's many more countries in Europe. I like to say Hungary, for example. How do we deal with countries that are having a completely different attitude towards Russia? How do you deal with that as nation states?
I think the solution is that if we would all agree as Europeans, accept the reality, which is that America doesn't see Europe anymore as the most important place to be in terms of defense and security, and that we as Europeans have to be responsible for our own area, which makes sense, then every country can decide why it's so important to focus on defense and security. So then we can find each other, I think. So unfortunately, I think the war in Ukraine and the threat from Russia, I think it's not enough for all the Europeans to step up when it comes to defense and security. I think the main message should be, and that requires communications, which we're not doing, is that we make clear to all our citizens that America has a new strategy, and it's the National Defense Strategy, National Security Strategy, and to be honest, it was already in Project 2025 crystal clear, that they will pull back in certain ways, not fully, but they will pull back more from Europe. And then we have to focus more on our own defense and security. And that makes sense. And that's something you can explain to your own population also when you're in Spain or in Italy. Because let's be honest, the countries in Southern Europe are not doing a lot when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Maloney, it's all nice, you can talk great, but look at the facts. What are the Italians really doing for Ukraine? It's not that much. The Dutch are doing much more. So I think there is something about the narrative, and that can, I think, be improved.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think when security becomes the dominant frame, it really crowds out all the other political conversations. They all get deprioritized and it creates resentment. And I think the antidote isn't to stop talking about security threats, because they are real, but we need to have a broader conversation as Europe of what we are protecting. Yeah. If we're only talking about threats and then, oh yeah, to Ukraine, it's pretty far away. Russia, well, they're not our neighbors. We need to talk about the values and the way of life we want to defend and we want to stay with. And I think what we see now is that it's constantly about security threat and what we should do and how we should prepare for it on a military level. Very much less economic security level, because you asked me earlier on, is Europe doing enough? Well, when it comes to strategic dependencies, I think we still have a lot of work to do there as well. But also how it's changing or what it means for a generation that grew up in relative peace to psychologically prepare maybe for conflict. That's also a profound shift in consciousness, and I don't think we're doing enough on it just by emphasizing on the threat all the time.
And tell me about what kind of work are we not doing, economically speaking?
Well, if we look at supply chain, for example, we're very much dependent on how the system is working right now. And what you see, for example, in the Netherlands, if the angry farmers are blocking a distribution center, it basically takes 3 hours and then the grocery stores get empty, for example.
Okay.
That's something many persons are aware of, but also when it comes to chip technology or very specific technologies, we're very codependent on each other within this world. And what you see from Canada to China with the national security strategies, most of them are taking economic security, economic safety, but also critical supplies into the national security strategy. And we also do have it in the Netherlands, but when I looked at the plans for the new coalition, I thought economic security was not on top of their list in it.
And is that because we're such a small country, so we're always been dependent on others in a sense that...
I think it's because it went well, right?
Yeah.
So the last few decades, everybody was happy, things were going well, so you had a good life, so what's the problem? And then we did get, in a very short term, 3 wake-up calls. The first one was, I think, regarding COVID, so the biggest pandemic in 100 years. And then it became crystal clear how dependent we were on industry, but also medical equipment. Think about the mondkapjes from Asia. So that was wake-up call 1, was not enough. Then wake-up call 2 was Ukraine, biggest war in Europe since Second World War. And we thought, oh yeah, the Russian gas, it's really cheap. But now we have to find something else. And the reality of today is that we're now fully dependent on Americans. With LNG, and the LNG, by the way, comes from fracking, something we don't like. So, okay, we're very having a double standard here. And then the third thing is Trump, who completely said the same as all the presidents before him. Europe, you have to do more for your own security, which makes sense. But he did it in such a way that we thought, okay, now it's really time to move. So I think Trump is in a certain way blessing in disguise. It's really a good moment. This is a momentum for Europe, but it should be more than Draghi. I think my problem is that, this should be more than, okay, let's make sure that we economically, in terms of industry and digitalization, become more independent. It's what you are saying, Nikki. There's something about values. Because let's be very honest, the Chinese know exactly which way they want to go. Yeah, okay, it's far away, it's 2049, but they know what to do. Also, the Americans, many of us don't like their vision and strategy, but they have one. They have one. And we don't really have one. We have got Draghi, but it should be, again, more than just an economic story. And then it's your point about values. And I think there's, again, a fantastic opportunity now. There's a momentum. And then all these things come together, also with responsibilities we have. And we will get regarding Ukraine and defense and security. But it's still fragmented. What I'm missing is the vision, strategy, and the values. Yeah.
Is it an opportunity or are we too late? I think we are fifth year of war, and we have only last year promised to increase our defense spending. Where we are now with our defense production, with capability gaps, we are slow. Very slow. We are behind what we should have done in 2022, 2023, 2024. We thought this war will be short, and it is dragging on. And I think you mentioned Chinese, and if Russia is making us more aware with regard to security and defense, especially here on the eastern flank, Trump is contributing to the change of the West European mindset. I think it's China that is key for economic security issues. For the security of supply, for critical resources. And I think this discussion is also worth having, especially in Western Europe. I think we are starting in Poland to understand what the Chinese goals are with regard to international security, economy, technology. Because we are seeing close Russian Chinese alignment. We are seeing Chinese helping Russia in waging this war. Without China, the Russians would have problems. We see how the Chinese are limiting access to Chinese critical resources, which will be more and more problematic for us. Here, paradoxically, the US is leading on it with the summit on critical resources. So the situation is more blurred, and I think we need, apart from Russia, US, we need to have also China in this picture as a huge challenge for Europe, especially in this economic dimension. And I'm not sure to what extent you here in the Netherlands are talking about that, but discussion about the implications of Chinese economic influence, economic cloud, economic policies on Europe is being heavily discussed.
I fully agree. And let's be honest, we have been very naive, particularly in Western Europe, on the Russian threat. Think about Nord Stream, etc. But with China, what I see at the moment, it's fascinating. Again, China is the leader of the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea alliance, the CRINC. And but at this moment, because we're so upset with Trump, you see Carney, you see Starmer, you see Merz, Macron, they all go to Chinese almost in terms of, okay, you're stable, good. Let's work with you because you're the stable guy. And then I think, Xi Jinping, okay, CCP, okay, I thought it's the biggest threat, okay. So we're completely inconsistent in terms of what Americans are doing. And actually, we could find each other there. I think if we would support more the American narrative on that, then the Americans would think, okay, you understand it. It's in the end, it's all about the Chinese threat, and linked to that Russia and the others. But it doesn't help is what recently happened, that Carney made a great deal with China and Starmer made a great deal. So. And again, that comes back to, I think that Europeans don't have a common strategy.
Nikki, do you want to add anything before I go to the audience?
I think we can go to the
Okay.
audience.
I may
yes,
add
please.
something on
Yes.
on how to deal with the countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic. I think that the picture is much more diffused because look at Slovakia and Czech Republic. They, together with Poland in 2020 to 2023, were the prime supporters of Ukraine, and the prime ministers made the first trip from as the leaders of EU NATO countries to Kiev. You had the Czech ammunition initiative. You have Slovakia giving so much military equipment to Ukraine. The mood has changed in these countries, but I think they with the current governments, they became more Russian friendly. In economic terms, especially, but that does not mean they do not value NATO. I think they perceive still the value in NATO as an alliance for that guarantee security and defense in Europe. And both Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia are stepping up with regard to defense investments, are in the defense plans of NATO, are participating in exercises. What we can do and what we are doing, actually, especially with regard to support of Ukraine, is sort of creating coalitions of the willing within the European Union with regard to, for example, a European peace facility with some countries, Hungary, not refraining for some certain actions, with regard to the loan to Ukraine that was agreed in autumn. Again, Hungary, Slovakia refraining from taking part. So there are ways and possibilities how to navigate also within the EU with regard to supporting Ukraine, not having these countries on board and still progressing. So there can be movement.
With ad hoc coalitions. Yeah, I agree.
Maybe one final question on this, because I want to ask you to elaborate on what happened to Georgia in this sense. Because that's, of course, a country who were very much looking towards Europe, who, if you walk in the streets of Tbilisi, you see the European flags everywhere, you see the NATO symbols everywhere, painted with graffiti on the walls. And now they're locking up the activists that were in front of Parliament for days, and we, as the EU, could have seen the Georgians as an ally against Putin, but then we did not very much, did we?
I think this is a tale of failure and European failure that we cannot repeat in case of Moldova, Armenia, and Ukraine. If we will let these countries, due to our own limitations, Europe particular interest on their way towards EU membership, especially I'm talking about Moldova, Ukraine. If there will be space, of course, for Ukrainian membership, if the war will end in a way that would allow Ukraine to join the EU, we should not delay it, discourage it, and take it seriously, because otherwise we might end up in both countries with such a scenario as we have right now in Georgia, that societies will be disappointed, will be disgruntled, and will slowly rethink their policies towards Russia, thinking that if a European path is not possible, it is better to make friends with Moscow, because that opens up certain possibilities. And I think this is a cautionary tale that we should not repeat with regard to our policies towards neighbors, Moldova, Ukraine, and increasingly Armenia, I think.
The interesting thing is that you're saying Armenia, because you mentioned in the beginning, Nikki, the dimension of values. It should always start with our values. And in your presentation, you talked also about the international world order and the importance of having values. But the problem is we talk a lot about values, but are we consistent in our values? how we deal with them. So if we ask the entire world to support Ukraine and our position when it comes to Ukraine, is that the same as we have behaved in the Middle East? And what about the biggest war in the world, which is Sudan? Nobody talks about. And what about Congo and Rwanda? And then you mentioned Armenia. So von der Leyen, she always talks about values, but I have not heard her at the moment when Azerbaijan took the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, and more than 100,000 people were forced to leave their homes. And we all looked away. And why did we look away? Because we needed the gas from Azerbaijan. Yeah. And that's how the Global South is looking at us. So if you listen to Lula, the Prime Minister of India, President of Brazil, or Modi, the Prime Minister of India, or Ramaphosa of South Africa, or Subianto of Indonesia, their speeches at international fora are always the same. Europeans, you don't practice what you preach. And then an example is, of course, also Armenia.
But paradoxically, Armenia-Azerbaijani relations have much improved after the resolution of the Karabakh issue.
Yeah, and thanks to Trump, not to us. Yeah.
No. I think this process has been irrelevant has begun before Trump. Trump has cleared some controversial issues between the two countries, but paradoxically, the fact that there is no Nagorno-Karabakh enclave anymore, which Russia used both against Armenia and Azerbaijan, has made a normalization of the relations between the two countries possible, even with the expelling of the Armenian population. We had a few days ago J.D. Vance's visit in the South Caucasus, bringing the two countries together. And paradoxically, before the Armenian elections that will come in spring this year, parliamentary elections, we may see normalization of the relations between Armenia and Turkey, with opening the border.
So that's a huge change in the South Caucasus. Our area and not the American area. So again, you see J.D. Vance there, and by the way, he said something about Armenian genocide, and immediately he took it away from Twitter. But what I'm missing there, and also your point about Georgia, we lost it. Because we didn't do what we were promising. And that's, I think, one of the risks with Ukraine. And that's why we have to be very careful now. And that's why I think we need a European approach.
Last words?
Last thing, because I think South Caucasus and Central Asia are super interesting cases. Because we have been talking about this affinity between Washington and Moscow on the level of the president's willingness to strike a deal. But the case of the South Caucasus and the U.S. engagement there between Armenia and Azerbaijan is actually pushing out the Russians, and the U.S. coming into back to the region is a case where U.S. is pushing out Russian influence in the region, and the same for the Central Asia. We have had a summit of the 5 Central Asian presidents in Washington for the first time ever, and more interest, U.S. interest and re-engagement in Central Asia. That means U.S. joining the game between the Russians, Chinese over there, and creating a new balance of power. So these relations between the US and Russia are not so black-white as many would like to see. Also with this, we are 1 year of the Trump presidency, no deal so far. So the picture is more grey.
Thank you very much for this conversation. I'm going to see if anyone wants to add something. Oh, veel vragen. Oké, begin even hier. Ik kan ze niet allemaal doen, helaas. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for your session. So we talked about a lot of issues, right? What I did not really hear yet today is the challenge of our own military industry, basically. A lot of countries are already investing billions into our defense capabilities. And I hear also today we're not strong enough yet on our own to defend Ukraine without the US, right? So what do you see as the main challenges in our military industry to be strong enough to stand on our own feet and defend Ukraine ourselves, basically?
Good. Yeah. Who wants to start?
time. I mean, they have all the money in the world at the moment to spend, but it's really difficult with long procedures. That's how we kind of structured the system. But that also means, I don't even know what the English word is for aanbestedingsprocedures, but there you go.
Procurement, yeah.
Procurement.
Okay.
So that's really a big challenge. And also here the strategic dependencies as well with weapons. Luckily, we do have some European weapon industry. But also here, so it's difficult. And also you need training, you need expertise. And it's also going really, really fast right now. I mean, I couldn't have imagined 10 years ago that drones would become such an important part of the level playing field at the moment. So it's all going pretty rapidly as well. So definitely you should do more than just giving money. I mean, you also need a strategic plan, but then you also need the capacity to carry it out and the structure to implement those plans.
I think we are much stronger than we think. Also in terms of economy, sometimes I think we are too scared for Trump, but we're also much too scared about Putin because our economy is 10 times bigger than the Russians. Russia is not more than the Benelux economy. The problem is that they have a lot of nuclear weapons. But when it comes to military, all the investments, don't underestimate what's going on, for instance, at the moment in Germany. It's enormous. Yeah, it takes time. It always takes time with Germans. But 5 years from now, we will see a very powerful system there in terms of economy, industry. They're spending a lot of money on it. There's one huge problem for the Dutch, and that's what I see every day with my work. They're not spending it on the European economy. So we all say Europe, we have to make Europe stronger again and make great again. And but the problem is that's what they say. But the reality is the French are spending it on the French and the Germans are spending it on the German industry. And there we have to be really careful because there it goes wrong at the moment already with procurement processes. I see it happening already with Dutch defense industries companies. They're losing because the French and Germans give extra money because of their system, staatssubsidies. And we don't do that because that's not how we do it. We don't have an industry policy. So a lot of things happening, but what are clearly missing is, let's say, the European approach. But they talk about it, but the reality is different, I think. But you probably know more about it.
I can give you my Polish perspective. I think there is no European industry, arms industry. There are national arms industries, and sometimes they are interlinked, like with multinational companies like Airbus. In the Polish case, I think we have done a lot of the procurement, or initiated a lot of procurement programs after 2022 or in 2022, 2023, and we are buying a lot now. And the problem was that we gave so much to Ukraine and we wanted to quickly replace this equipment in operational units. And the only available products that were on the market that we needed in a reasonable time frame were the US or South Koreans, because South Koreans had a lot of stocks. They could give us some batches of what they had in stock and then produce and co-produce then on the third stage in Poland. Same with the US. And if one example of the tanks, we have given a lot of tanks to Ukraine, we need to replace them. And there was then a survey when we could get Leopards, Abrams or South Korean tanks. And Leopards we could get after the Norwegian procurement 2032. And we have already Abrams and South Korean tanks being introduced into our land forces. And now we have, of course, a huge debate in Poland. How can we support a domestic industry? And we are doing that actually right now with refocusing our procurement towards Polish products in collaboration with Europeans. But the first and foremost factor for buying equipment was time,
meaning the delivery time. And then it's also, I think, and this dilemma is also present in Western Europe. Are you buying what is on the shelf, and that's not necessarily European, or are you investing in R&D and long processes? And for Poland, the answer was clear, because 2020, the limit or the date was 2026, 2027, where we should have military able to operate land forces especially, but also air force. And we cannot then afford to, engage in R&D or wait, or in some multilateral European projects. So it's a question, this is this dilemma, and you need to wait.
Yeah, and
I'm going to stop you here because I have. I'm going to take 3 all at once, and then we can take them to the table. You go first.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. And I have a question about the paradox, which I still find quite perplexing, that on the one hand, European countries are so prepared to spend all these billions of euro for preparedness in the long term for Russia, at some point, while at the same time, right now, when Russia can actually be stopped by closing the loopholes of sanctions, by closing the shadow fleet, by helping Ukraine with offensive capabilities like with towers, which we have been seeing, when you can actually destroy the risks and not spend all of these budgets, which can actually go for security in the broader dimension than just military. I just don't understand the logic of it, and to be honest, it becomes problematic that this percentage-based spending becomes a mantra, and we actually overlook the societal impacts of all these billions, and we overlook what we also underspend in democracy, development, all the 3D approach. So I would be very happy to hear your perspective on, how to reconcile this and actually have a comprehensive approach to security. Thank you.
I'm going to take another question. Who will take this one?
I think Nikki. Oh,
Nikki?
Both. Both. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, ik had nog geen vraag. Oh nee, ik had
Sorry. Foutje, sorry. Even kijken, ik had hier een tweede vraag, hè? Ja.
Again, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. What I miss in the whole discussion is something I think very important at the moment. Looking also at the end of the New START Treaty, is the European nuclear strategy. Looking at the fact that we are now very sure that we are not sure that America, if Article 5 is involved, and say, for example, a scenario where Rotterdam will be nuked by Russia, that there will be a retaliation coming from America. That's not sure anymore. That means the deterrence strategy that we always have is gone. It's what Putin counts on. What about the discussion about the European nuclear strategy? That means also in the longer term, building up a nuclear deterrence force and a full nuclear triad.
Thank you. And then I have one more over here, and then we're going to take them all 3.
Yeah, this one is specifically to Mr. Krijger. It's about the common European strategy. And one of the questions I have about that is, with all the political divides that we currently see within Europe, within the different countries, but also within countries internally with right-wing nationalist parties, anti-EU or European parties coming to power, how do you see them coming together and forming one common strategy?
Regarding defense, security for
Should we
Europe?
start with this one?
The last one, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, good point. Because, and you know it better than I do, Nikki, but I did see a picture, just a research poll just 2 months ago, where, and correct me if I'm wrong there, but in UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy, and it was before the Dutch elections, by the way, a lot of European countries, the PVV, or the party that's the same as the PVV, so far-right party, was the #1 in the polls. So again, if we talk about the bigger picture, so a very good question, is I think we have to realize not only for the US it's the midterms, but in Europe it's the French elections next year. Because if, don't forget what Merz has said. At the moment when he started his coalition government, the first thing he said, this is the last opportunity for the political center. Last moment. So we have to succeed. That's what he said. So I think, again, we have to be much better in terms of our engagement with the entire population, the whole society, that's the way they call it, in terms of what's going on, the fact that we have to stand on our own feet with regard to all these things, industry, etc., including defense and security. As long as we're not doing that, then we only see the costs, then we don't see the bigger picture, and then there's a risk that Bardella, what's his age, 30 years or something, is in the Élysée next year, and then it's too late. Okay. So that's, I think, where we are at the moment. So it's all about sense of urgency.
However, I do think this constant drumbeat of threat narratives is also creating fear-based politics. And it's also creating the deprioritization of social inequality, healthcare, climate change, all these important topics that are now somehow not being regarded as essential. And that is also creating just resentment, particularly among people who feel their immediate concerns are being ignored with all this geopolitical talk they see on the news every day. So I do think it does feed into each other.
Yeah, fully agree.
I want to go to the second question.
Yeah, the nuclear
one.
I think is, so if you go back to, you said the deterrence from the US is gone. I think it's not true. Because if you read the national security strategy and new defense strategy of the US, it's still crystal clear that they say Europe has to stand on its own feet. Makes sense, I think, in terms of their own security defense. So the Europeans have to take care of what's going on in Europe, including Ukraine, so also Poland, etc., etc. But when it comes to, so conventional, but when it comes to nuclear, then still Article 5, and then still we have to play our role, and we will play a role because, to be honest, the Europeans can't do it. But the discussions going on at the moment regarding nuclear capabilities, there's a lot of discussion about, do we have to work together with the French, for instance? What I sometimes miss is the UK dimension, because why not talk more with the UK about the UK nuclear umbrella? So why always only focus on France? So I don't understand that, to be honest. But there's an issue there, I think, because of material, and they're not EU, and blah, blah, blah.
They left us.
Yeah, but Starmer's everywhere, I think.
Yeah,
so
that's what they always do, I want to say.
But did they really...
I can add something
Justyna?
on the
UK.
European nuclear strategy. I think I do agree. I think that for now the US is committed still to NATO, with limited in the future limiting its conventional capabilities for Europe's defense. But they are openly saying that extended nuclear deterrence is there, and this is good news, because otherwise we would be in a very difficult position. But I think in general we need to beef up or make nuclear deterrence in Europe stronger, and we can do it two ways in short-term period. First way, increase nuclear sharing arrangements. You have one with the US, as the Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Turkey, and Poland would like to join these sharing arrangements with the US, meaning maybe not, if not stationing US nuclear weapons on Polish territory, then at least we'll soon have F-35s to certify them and, for example, cooperate with the Netherlands in carrying out nuclear missions, carrying out tactical nuclear weapons with Polish F-35s from US bases here in the Netherlands. So this is one way. Second way is how to use the French and the UK nuclear deterrence and how to interlink it with the NATO one, and how to make these two countries cooperate, which they are already, they have started to do so. How can we link NATO nuclear exercises and French and the British exercises? How can these exercises take place, for example, in our part of Europe? How can the French could, for example, make a show of force throughout our region with nuclear-capable fighter jets, showing to the Russians that they are there. So this is the way of how, in the short term, we can make the nuclear deterrence stronger. But there is one point where I agree, and I think we need to think, at least in a more structured way, what if? And how could we organize ourselves in Europe with regard to building up a European nuclear deterrence and a full triad and increasing nuclear tactical weapons? I do agree that's a very difficult discussion. That's a long-term project, but I think we need to discuss this. And possibly we are awaiting an important speech on nuclear strategy by President Macron. We'll see what he will say. So far, the French have been very reluctant with regard to entering into such a debate, because that would mean that other Europeans, first of all, the Germans and the Poles, and the Swedes, we are geographically quite strategically located. Germany, a conventional power, but without an own nuclear deterrence, Germany has its weaknesses. And has vis-à-vis a nuclear power like Russia, Germany is not in a position to take strategic decisions without concerted European action together with the French and with the UK, unless if there is no US backing. So Germany, Poland, because of the threat, Sweden, because of its position, because of its Sweden wants to build a nuclear weapon on its own in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We are interested in this debate, and we want the French to open more to such discussions. French have been so far reluctant, but I hope that will come at least on an expert level in order to think about how such a European nuclear deterrent could be structured in the future. On the triad, on financing, on decision-making, because I don't think that we can rely on the French, Bartella and the Élysée, and what with the French nuclear deterrent then? No, these are all very sensitive, sensible, important questions.
Thank you very much. Going to the last question. Why all this huge spending if there might be another road? Loops in the sanctions, to name one thing.
Yeah, the loopholes, great point. It's terrible, of course. The Americans have completely a good, valid point there every time in their speeches. Mm-hmm. Think about Rubio and the others. And you know that probably better than I do, but there's still billions are going from Europe via Turkey and Kazakhstan and a lot of other countries to Russia. Mm-hmm. And we're still buying gas. And by the way, also France, again, Macron, big words, but reality is that he's still importing Russian gas. So, yeah, those loopholes, we've got now 20 packages, I think, on sanctions or something. Mm-hmm. What we really have to do is stop it. And that's, I think, where the Americans have a good point. We should be more firm on that. And because also, else you're inconsistent with your support and also to your own population. So that's not sustainable, I think.
I think you made a very good point on Ukraine being central to European security, which is missing. Also in Poland, slowly is disappearing from the debate. And I was talking about that. Ukraine is failure or Russian success in Ukraine will determine Russian actions towards Europe. And hence, we need to think about Ukraine as an element of European security. And the support for Ukraine, and in order to prevent Russian success and Ukraine's failure, should be perceived in this wider framework. And I think we are not enough thinking in these categories. We are perceiving often this war in Europe as an isolated war between Russia and Ukraine, and the end of which might have some effects on us, but not so crucial. And I think the end of the war in Ukraine will have crucial effect for European security, and we need to be aware of that.
Thank you all, Nikki Sterkenburg, Alex Krijger and Justyna Gotkowska, very much for being here. Thank you for being I really felt the the concentration in the hall. That was very lovely. So thank you for being a fantastic audience. Thank you for watching this. And I hope you will come back at some point. That would be very lovely. Thank you very much for being here and see you next time.